Let's look at history from another angle, not as a dusty album of glories, but as a string of risky decisions, improvisations that nearly tipped into catastrophe, and victories that only seem easy in the rearview mirror. In July 1969, humanity stepped onto the moon. You've heard that part. What almost never comes with it is the number that changes everything. In 3 years, NASA pulled off 6 crewed landings. 6. In a time span that would sound absurd today. Why? Because the goal wasn't just get there. It was to learn how to land where they wanted, operate with surgical precision, and turn a spectacle into a method. So get ready. What follows is the chronicle of how an entire program turned the moon from a stage into a laboratory, amid electrical scares, cameras burned by the sun, seismographs making the satellite ring, and an electric rover that pushed the frontier. As the dust from the first landing settled, November 1969 brought Apollo 12. Charles Pete Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean rode the Saturn V with a mission that went beyond symbolism: prove accuracy. The first landing worked, but it was far from the target. To truly explore, close enough wouldn't cut it. They needed to touch down exactly where science demanded. The chosen address was bold and instructive: the crater of Surveyor 3, a robotic probe that had landed in 1967. Picture it, arriving just steps from hardware already sitting on the terrain, inspecting the neighbor, bringing pieces back, and, to top it off, broadcasting everything in color thanks to a brand new camera. It looked like a masterstroke. The weather hadn't agreed to the plan. Liftoff happened in a storm. Not a metaphor. Heavy skies, lightning, bad conditions. The pressure to launch was real. President Richard Nixon and the First Lady were in the audience, and missing the window would push the mission by months. The rocket vanished into the clouds. 36 seconds later, at 6,000 feet, about 1,800 meters, lightning struck the spacecraft. Panels lit up, alarms blared, telemetry vanished. 16 seconds after that, at 14,000 feet, 4,300 meters, another strike. Main power compromised. Guidance and navigation offline. A column of metal and fuel on a path to the worst. Now what? Here's the part that never makes the poster. A controller on the ground dug from memory a sim of a similar failure and called out the cue that, to lay people, sounds like technical gibberish. SCE to AUX. In simple terms, switch the signal conditioning to the auxiliary mode. A tucked-away toggle. A command half the team barely remembered. And suddenly, instruments flickered back. Data returned. The mission breathed again. The Saturn V kept going. Lesson etched in stone. No one would ever launch in a thunderstorm again. Once the adrenaline faded, the precision test arrived. Apollo 12 landed about 180 meters from Surveyor, a near front door touchdown. Back on Earth, millions tuned in for the first color broadcast from the surface. And it began. But the moon doesn't forgive mistakes. With no atmosphere, sunlight arrives raw and brutal. In minutes, Alan Bean pointed the camera straight at the sun. The result? Vacuum tubes fried. The gear was dead. Goodbye TV. What remained was the essential. Trek to Surveyor 3. Remove components and bring them home. The first human-made objects to spend years beyond Earth and return for analysis. They also left behind the Surface Instrument Package, the ALSEP, including a seismograph to record lunar quakes. How do you test a seismograph? You make a shake. After the lunar module lifted off and rejoined the command module, the descent stage was sent crashing into the surface. The sensor picked up vibrations for nearly an hour. The phrase "the moon rang like a bell" made headlines. More than poetry, it was a message. Beneath the gray, the satellite held secrets about its inner structure, and it was ready to tell them. Then came the mission that put risk center stage, Apollo 13. Midway there, an electrical fault blew an oxygen tank in the service module. In minutes, a trip to the far side turned into a race for life. The whole world watched real-time survival math. The crew made it back, against the odds. But the spell of invincibility was broken. From then on, no one could look at the lunar program without tallying every risk. And still, the next one had to fly. Almost a year later, Apollo 14 launched with an emotional objective: restore confidence. Leading was Alan Shepard, the first American in space, now 47, the oldest to wear a lunar suit, and more pressure arrived before landing. Docking the command module to the lunar module failed once, twice, 6 times. The pilot had to separate the spacecraft, turn, and lock the nose into the other vehicle's hatch. In theory, the electronics helped. In practice, nothing latched. Shepard made a cold decision. Shut off the docking system and trust the pilot's eye and hand. A fine, almost instinctive adjustment. And finally, click result. When it came time to touch down, Apollo 14 landed a little over 87 feet from the target, about 26.5 meters. Surgeon-level precision, and there was room for humanity amid all the technique. Shepard brought, hiding in plain sight, the head of a 6-iron attached to a sampling tool and 2 golf balls. Limited by the suit, he swung one-handed in front of the live camera. First miss, second swing, clean contact. The ball skipped off toward the horizon. He joked about miles and miles. Calculations put it around 40 yards, about 37 meters. Numbers aside, the message landed. Behind valves and checklists, there were people out there, and the public needed that reminder. The operational shift came with Apollo 15. The plan stopped being touch and go and became stay and explore. With life support improvements, the surface duo got 3 full days to work. To extend their reach, the star was a new vehicle. The Lunar Roving Vehicle, an electric open-seat cart, roughly 15 kilometers per hour top speed, and about 90 kilometers of range. With it, the astronauts crossed mountain chains and ancient solidified lava plains. From that work came the Genesis rock, a 4.1 billion-year-old piece of history, nearly as old as the solar system itself. And in a teachable moment that became a classic, the astronauts dropped a feather and a hammer at the same time. With no air to slow the feather, both hit the ground together. What Galileo proposed centuries earlier finally had a definitive image. April 1972 took Apollo 16 to the lunar highlands. These were bright, very old regions once considered candidates for colossal primordial volcanoes. Among the crew, a familiar name from the program's back rooms finally earned the right to track lunar dust into his boots. But the landscape told a different story. Those ridges weren't born of lava. They'd been heaved up by violent impacts that churned the subsurface and shoved layers upward. The geological read changed on the spot. It flipped a key for understanding the moon, and, by extension, the processes that remake airless worlds. Apollo 16 also brought a sensory account few expect from science. Lunar dust stuck to skin with an oily feel and gave off a smell like gunpowder. Close your eyes and imagine that dry scent flooding a pressurized cabin. The moon announcing itself, even through smell. In December 1972 came the final act, Apollo 17. Public interest? Dropping. Political support? Fragile. Even so, NASA put together the most complete crewed lunar mission ever, and that's not a figure of speech. For the first and only time, a trained scientist walked on the moon. Geologist Harrison Schmitt trained to fly the lunar module and, more importantly, read the terrain like an open book. The destination was the Taurus Littrow Valley, ringed by steep-sided mountains exposing deep layers of the past. The pair spent 75 hours on the surface, an all-time record, logged 22 hours of EVAs, and drove more than 36 kilometers with the rover, reaching over 7 kilometers from the landing site. In one dig, Schmitt found something that seemed to contradict every black and white photo: orange soil hidden beneath the gray. Back on Earth, analysis revealed microscopic glass beads. Volcanic glass formed about 3.6 billion years ago, a colorful beacon pointing to the satellite's eruptive past. In all, the mission brought back 741 samples of rocks and soil, totaling 110 kilograms, the largest haul of the series. That collection became the basis for much of what we know about lunar volcanism and the early solar system. At the same time, inside the agency, the consensus was clear. Apollo's season was over. There were hints we'd return one day, but not the next day. Commander Eugene Cernan was the last to step off the surface and climb the ladder. The words he left were a wish for peace and hope, more than a goodbye, a promise to keep the conversation going with that world. 6 landings in 3 years. Lined up in sequence, the learning curve jumps out. Apollo 12 turned an almost electrical disaster into a resilience handbook and nailed a near pinpoint landing, even with the camera sacrificed to the sun. 13 rubbed risk right onto the TV screen and forced the entire program to rethink what it was willing to face. 14 proved the human hand still matters when electronics balk, and drew a smile with a golf ball bouncing in a vacuum. 15 stretched the map with the rover and brought back a rock that holds the dawn of the solar system. 16 rewrote the origin of the highlands and logged the harsh smell of the dust. 17 put a geologist on the scent, found orange soil, and delivered the biggest load of answers and more questions. We can end with a provocation. If one program could do all that so quickly, why haven't we gone back? Because staying on the moon systematically demands budget, sustained political will, and a purpose that survives trends and headlines. Apollo proved not only that landing is possible, but that you can turn landings into science. Pick targets, set up instruments, test hypotheses, come back with samples, refine models. And maybe most importantly, it showed the value of responsible improvisation. Sometimes the line between a technical report and an obituary is an obscure switch on a panel, flipped at the right moment. Now, with the Artemis program, that conversation reopens, with different ambitions. It's not about replaying 1969, it's about establishing presence, returning to the South Pole to study water ice in situ, turning local resources into air and propellant, setting up instruments that run for years, and taking scientists into the field with long-range rovers. The Orion capsule carries the crew, the lander descends, and every step onto the regolith becomes a dress rehearsal for living and working off-Earth, a necessary step toward Mars. The meaning of going back changes. It isn't nostalgia, it's continuity. It's using what Apollo taught us about risk, precision, and curiosity to build a lunar routine that generates knowledge, a cislunar economy, and, who knows, the first human base on another world. So, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, leave a like, and tell us in the comments, what do you think we should do first when we step onto the moon again? Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.